The Gobi Desert, Central Asia, summer 630 CE. The monk has been walking for 5 days without water. His horse, the one given to him by a sympathetic border guard who took pity on a man attempting the crossing alone, collapsed on the 4th day and did not rise again. He is on foot, somewhere inside the Mohe-yan, the sea of moving sand that Chinese cartographers marked on their maps simply as a void. No roads, no landmarks, no shelter from a sun that turns the air above the dunes into a visible shimmer. The heat comes from above and reflects back from below simultaneously. He navigates by the bones. Huili, his disciple, records what Xuanzang told him years later in private, that the route across the Gobi was marked not by stones or painted posts, but by the skeletal remains of horses and men who had attempted the same crossing before him. White bones in yellow sand, spaced at irregular intervals, pointing roughly in the direction of water that may or may not still exist on the other side of the desert. On the 5th night, he collapses, he prays, and then Huili records this with complete seriousness. A cool wind arrives from nowhere, and the horse somehow rises from the sand. But before this desert, before the bones, the collapsed horse, the prayer, the wind, before all of it, Xuanzang was the most celebrated young monk in the greatest city on earth. A prodigy who had memorized entire sutras at 13, a teacher who was correcting senior scholars at 25, a man with a library, students, a monastery, and a future completely mapped out for him. He threw all of it away for a question that was eating him alive. I'm Marcus, and today we're following Xuanzang across the world that was dying. This is the story of a man who went looking for the eternal word of the Buddha and found instead the graveyard of civilizations, and whose account is the only reason we know that any of those civilizations existed at all. Xuanzang was born around 602 CE in Henan province, the youngest son of a family of Confucian scholars. His father was a government administrator. 3 of his brothers had already taken monastic vows. By the time he was 13, the abbot of a monastery in Luoyang had admitted him on the strength of his memory alone. He could reproduce entire Buddhist sutras after a single reading with no errors. By his mid-20s, he was already teaching monks twice his age. And this is exactly where the problem began. The Chinese Buddhist canon of the early 7th century was a library built on a foundation of translation errors. The texts had traveled from India to China across 4 centuries and 3 or 4 intermediary languages: Sanskrit to Parthian, Parthian to Sogdian, Sogdian to Chinese, sometimes directly, sometimes not, always through translators who were working without dictionaries for concepts that had no Chinese equivalents. The word for the Buddhist concept of sunyata, the fundamental emptiness or voidness of all phenomena, had been rendered into Chinese in at least 6 different ways, each implying something slightly different, several implying something essentially opposite. Xuanzang read every version of every text he could locate. The contradictions multiplied. On questions of fundamental doctrine of the nature of consciousness, the mechanics of rebirth, the relationship between perception and reality, the Chinese translations did not agree with each other, which meant the Chinese Buddhist tradition was, at its philosophical foundation, arguing with itself about problems it had never actually understood clearly. He needed the originals. He needed India. In 629 CE, possibly 627 CE, the sources differ by 2 years, Xuanzang submitted a formal petition to Emperor Taizong requesting permission to travel west to retrieve Sanskrit texts. Taizong refused. The Tang Empire was engaged in military operations against the Eastern Göktürk Khaganate. The frontier was closed. Unauthorized crossing of the imperial border was a capital offense. Xuanzang left anyway. He slipped through the Jade Gate, the western terminus of the Great Wall, the edge of the known world by Tang administrative definition, sometime in the late autumn, alone, traveling at night. He was 27 years old. He had never been outside China. He had no imperial passport, no letters of safe conduct, no traveling companions. What he had was a list of the texts he needed and the name of a monastery in India that was said to possess them. Huili describes his teacher's physical appearance with the precision of a man who spent years in close proximity. His eyes were like clear pools. His deportment was grave and unhurried. His voice, when he lectured, carried to the back of a hall of 1,000 monks without apparent effort. What Huili does not describe, but what emerges unmistakably from Xuanzang's own writing, is a mind constitutionally incapable of tolerating ambiguity. He was not a mystic. Mystics are comfortable with mystery. They often prefer it. Xuanzang was a scholar with the internal architecture of an engineer. Every problem had a correct answer, and the correct answer could be located if you were willing to travel far enough to find the source document. The contradictions in the Chinese Buddhist translations were not, to him, rich interpretive openings. They were errors. Errors with known causes, and errors that could be corrected. This is what made him extraordinary. And this is what made him, in 629 CE, a criminal. Most pilgrims who attempted the journey to India in the 7th century were driven by devotion. They wanted to walk the ground where the Buddha had walked, collect sacred relics, visit the ancient sites. Xuanzang wanted a complete library. He traveled with a checklist. His Datang Shiyuji, the account he wrote at Emperor Taizong's request after his return, dictated in a single year, covers 138 separate kingdoms and territories along his route. For each one, he records the climate, the coinage, the language, the script, the principal crops, the local funeral customs, the current state of Buddhist practice, the presence or absence of Brahmanical temples, and the quality of the local water. He notes which monasteries have functioning libraries and which have been reduced to rubble. He notes the dimensions of collapsed stupas with the same care he applies to living ones. He is, without using the word, conducting an archaeological survey of a world in the process of disappearing. When he crossed the Gobi Desert alone and nearly died of thirst, he took notes. This was not bravery. It was methodology. The Silk Road was not a road. It was a system of overlapping caravan routes, river valleys, mountain passes, and oasis towns, connected not by pavement but by the shared logic of where water could be found and where bandits could not easily follow. A merchant leaving Chang'an for Samarkand might take any of 4 different routes depending on the season, the current political situation among the Göktürk factions controlling the northern steppe, and the state of the passes through the Tian Shan Mountains. Xuanzang's route took him west from the Jade Gate across the Moheyan to the oasis of Hami, then southwest through the flaming mountains of Turfan. The flaming mountains are not a metaphor. They are a range of red sandstone ridges running through the Turfan Depression, the hottest region in China, a basin sitting 154 meters below sea level, where summer ground temperatures regularly reach 70 degrees Celsius, and the rock oxidizes in the heat into shades of deep crimson and orange. In the afternoon light, with the heat shimmer rising from the surface, they appear genuinely to be on fire. In the 16th century, Wu Cheng'an would place a fire-breathing demon there in his novel and have the Monkey King extinguish it with a magic fan. The real obstacle was simpler and harder. The heat killed pack animals. Xuanzang records passing through dried carcasses and scattered bones on the approach. The bones of horses and men left where they fell were the only indication that anyone had survived the route long enough to leave a body on the far side. Beyond the Flaming Mountains, the route entered the Fergana Valley, a long, fertile corridor between the Tian Shan and Pamir ranges, running east to west through what is now Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan. Xuanzang describes it as green, well-watered, full of horses. The Fergana Valley had been exporting its famous horses, the heavenly horses that Chinese emperors had been sending armies to acquire for centuries, westward across the steppe since before the Han Dynasty. It was one of the few stretches of the entire route where the land was not visibly dying. Then the Hindu Kush. The pass Xuanzang used, almost certainly the Kawak, at 3,548 meters elevation, was snow-covered even in late summer. He records crossing glaciers. He records watching pack animals lose their footing on ice and disappear into the crevasses below. He records nights in rock shelters where the cold was sufficient to kill an exhausted man who fell asleep without covering his face. He records crossing a river in flood where the current knocked 2 horses off their feet. On the other side of the Hindu Kush, the Kabul Valley, the kingdom of Kapisa, and the ruins of what had been 3 centuries earlier, one of the wealthiest and most cosmopolitan civilizations the ancient world had produced. Xuanzang's Da Tang Shiyuji is, among many things, the most systematic record of civilizational death that the 7th century produced. The first kingdom to attempt to hold him was Gaochang, a prosperous oasis state in the Turfan Basin ruled by King Ku Wentai. Ku Wentai was ethnically Chinese, devoutly Buddhist, and in a permanent state of political anxiety. His kingdom sat between the Tang Empire to the east and the western Göktürk Khaganate to the north, and its survival depended on keeping both powers satisfied simultaneously. When he received word that a famous scholar monk from the Tang capital was passing through his territory, he sent an escort, not to help Xuanzang continue, but to bring him to court. Ku Wentai offered him everything: a permanent residence, 20 horses, 4 personal attendants, a monthly stipend of silk and gold, a temple constructed to Xuanzang's exact specifications, staffed with monks of his choosing. He wanted Xuanzang's presence the way medieval European lords wanted saints' relics, as a form of concentrated spiritual authority that might protect a fragile kingdom from its enemies. Xuanzang refused. Ku Wentai had him locked in his guest apartments and reduced his food. If the monk would not stay willingly, hunger would cooperate on the king's behalf. Xuanzang fasted in return. He simply stopped eating and sat in meditation. After 3 days, when it became clear that the monk was willing to die rather than be detained, Ku Wentai capitulated. He wept openly. He gave Xuanzang 30 horses, travel funds, and personal letters of introduction to the Göktürk Khagan, letters that would prove invaluable, and escorted him to the western border of Gaochang himself. 14 years later, Tang armies destroyed Gaochang for strategic reasons that had nothing to do with Xuanzang. Ku Wentai died of shock and grief. The Chinese sources say literally this: upon receiving news that the Tang Emperor had decided to absorb his kingdom, he died before the armies arrived. He never saw the end. Xuanzang did not record his reaction when he learned of it. Beyond Gaochang, the route crossed into the territory of the Western Gokturk Khaganate, the nomadic empire that controlled the Eurasian steppe from the Caspian Sea to the edge of Manchuria. The Khagan received Xuanzang in a tent of green silk on a golden throne surrounded by officers in embroidered brocade robes. Xuanzang describes the scene with the compressed admiration of a man deeply impressed by what he is seeing and the careful neutrality of a man who knows his account will be read by the Tang Emperor. The Gokturks were, at that moment, at the absolute peak of their power. They would begin their terminal fragmentation within a single generation. Further south and west, in the territories that had once been the Kushan Empire, the extraordinary civilization that had, between the 1st and 3rd century CE, synthesized Greek artistic forms, Indian religious philosophy, and Persian commercial sophistication into something that had no precedent and no successor, Xuanzang found ruins. Not metaphorical ruins, physical ones. Cities he describes as desolate, with no inhabitants. Monasteries half collapsed into the earth. Stupas with their spires fallen and their Buddha images exposed to rain. The Kushans had been crushed by the Sasanian Persians, then by the Hephthalites, then by early Gokturk expansion. By the time Xuanzang crossed Bactria, the heartland of the old empire, the region that Alexander the Great had marveled at 4 centuries before Christ, the cities that had once sent diplomatic missions to Rome and received Han Dynasty trade goods were archaeological sites inhabited by fragments of their former populations. He records them anyway, their former dimensions, their surviving inscriptions, the number of monks still resident in the roofless monasteries, the texts still legible on the collapsed walls. He was doing, without the vocabulary for it, the work of an archaeologist. This wasn't sentiment, it was professional habit. But reading it today, reading a 7th century monk describing the ruins of a 3rd century empire with the precise detachment of a surveyor, the grief is impossible to miss. In 631 CE, roughly 2 years after crossing the Jade Gate alone in the dark, Xuanzang arrived at Nalanda. He had known of it his entire scholarly life. Every serious Buddhist thinker in 7th century China had known of it, the way medieval European scholars knew of the great cathedral schools as the place where the real work was happening, where the real texts existed, where the real arguments were being conducted by the people qualified to conduct them. Nalanda was the largest university on earth. Located in the Gangetic plain of what is now Bihar in northeastern India, it had been in continuous operation since approximately the 5th century CE, over 150 years before Xuanzang arrived. The numbers he records are difficult to hold in the mind. 10,000 students in residence at any given time. 1,500 faculty, 8 separate walled colleges connected by covered walkways and formal gardens extending across several kilometers of campus, a library complex, the Dharma Ganja, housed in 3 separate buildings, the tallest of which stood 9 stories and contained texts collected from across the Buddhist world over 2 centuries. Admission required passing an oral examination on a substantial portion of the Buddhist canon. Most applicants failed. The gatekeepers, senior monks stationed at the entrance, were authorized to debate any arriving scholar on any text before allowing entry. When Xuanzang arrived, the gatekeeper engaged him in a philosophical exchange that Huili records lasted nearly 2 hours. He passed. He stayed for 5 years. The intellectual culture at Nalanda operated on a principle Xuanzang had encountered nowhere at this intensity: debate as the primary method of knowledge production. Not debate as argument between rivals, but debate as a furnace in which ideas were subjected to the maximum possible pressure to determine which ones held their structure when everything was burning. A scholar who could not defend his positions in open debate, in Sanskrit, in real time, against the best minds in the institution, was not considered at Nalanda to have genuinely understood his own positions. Xuanzang studied under the master Silabhadra, then over 100 years old, the greatest living authority on the Yogacara school of philosophy, a man who had been teaching at Nalanda for decades and who recognized in this monk from the far east of the world a quality of mind he had rarely encountered. Silabhadra taught him personally. Xuanzang also copied texts. Before dawn, after evening prayers, in whatever hours the formal study schedule left open, he copied with systematic urgency, the urgency of a man who had walked through enough ruined libraries to understand that the texts he was copying might not exist in 10 years or 100 in the places he had found them. He was right about that. Nalanda was burned by Turkic invaders in 1193 CE, its scholars killed or scattered, its library reduced to ash and char in a fire that, by some accounts, burned for months. The destruction was so complete and the subsequent political disruption so total that the site of the university was entirely forgotten. It was rediscovered by British archaeologists in 1861, buried under centuries of accumulated sediment. Its location identified by cross-referencing the excavated ruins with the precise geographic coordinates Xuanzang had recorded in the Da Tong Xiu Ji 500 years before anyone knew it was gone. For certain texts, Xuanzang's copies were the only copies that survived. He left India in 643 CE, 14 years after slipping through the Jade Gate in the dark. What he carried back: 657 Sanskrit texts wrapped in cloth and distributed across the backs of 22 horses, 150 relics of the Buddha, seeds of the Bodhi tree, the species of sacred fig under whose shade the historical Buddha attained enlightenment, a species that had never grown in China, an ivory statue of the Buddha from Magadha commissioned by Xuanzang himself, modeled on the posture of the original image at Bodh Gaya, and detailed notes in his own hand on 138 kingdoms, their geographic coordinates, their political structures, their languages, their surviving monuments, and their ruins. The return crossing of the Hindu Kush cost him 1 horse and 20 texts. The animal stumbled, crossing a river swollen with snowmelt, and the waterproofed cases strapped to its back were swept downstream before anyone could reach them. Xuanzang records the loss with the specific, focused grief of a librarian. He names the texts individually. He describes their contents. He records which ones were irreplaceable. He arrived at the western frontier of the Tang Empire in 645 CE. The border officials sent word to Chang'an. Emperor Taizong, the same emperor who had refused permission for the journey, who had made the crossing a capital offense, who had governed the most powerful empire in the world for the 16 years Xuanzang had been walking, dispatched an imperial reception committee to escort the monk to the capital. The man who had slipped through the Jade Gate alone in darkness was brought back to Chang'an in a formal procession. Taizong received him in person and asked him 2 things: to write a full account of everything he had seen and to begin translating the texts immediately. Xuanzang agreed to both, Taizong offered him a position in the imperial government and a residence inside the palace walls. Xuanzang declined both. What he accepted was a translation bureau, a scriptorium staffed with assistant monks, copyists, and Sanskrit scholars, funded by imperial treasury, housed in the Qian monastery in Chang'an. He translated for 19 years without interruption. He died in 664 CE, mid-project, with texts still open on his desk. His travel diary, the Datang Xiuji, was considered a secondary work. Useful, perhaps, for scholars interested in geography, but not the main event. The translations were the point. For 12 centuries, it sat in libraries, read occasionally, cited rarely. Then, in 1900, a Hungarian-British archaeologist named Aurel Stein picked up a translated copy of the Xiuji and walked into the Taklamakan Desert. He was looking for the cities Xuanzang had described, the ones that had gone silent, been swallowed by sand, vanished from every map. He used Xuanzang's directional descriptions, his estimated distances between settlements, his notes on which oases were reliable and which had dried up. He found Nia exactly where Xuanzang said it would be. He found Lulan. He found Miran, with its Buddhist murals still intact under the sand, painted in a Greco-Roman style that proved concretely that the artistic traditions of the Mediterranean had traveled the full length of the Silk Road and fused with Buddhist iconography in a desert city most people had never heard of. A monk's travel diary, written in 645 CE, at an emperor's command, was directing 20th century excavations across a landscape that no longer resembled itself. Was this the purpose of the diary? Of course not. Xuanzang wrote it because Taizong asked him to. He wrote it in the same methodical spirit he brought to everything. Complete the task, record what you observed, move on to the translation work. He had no idea the cities he was describing were in the process of disappearing. He had no idea his notes on water sources and road conditions would become, 12 centuries later, the most accurate map of a vanished world in existence. The diary survived because it was useful. It turned out to be useful in ways no one had imagined. The Dharma Ganja, Nalanda's library, 9 stories of accumulated knowledge, is ash. The Western Göktürk Kaghanata does not exist. Gaochang is an archaeological site in the Turfan Desert, its mud brick walls dissolving slowly back into the earth they were molded from. The kingdoms of Kapisa and Bactria are footnotes in academic journals read by specialists. The Kushan Empire is a museum category. Xuanzang's translations are still in active liturgical use in Buddhist temples across East Asia today. The Datang Xiuji, his travelogue, dictated in a single year at an emperor's command, covering 138 kingdoms in verifiable geographic detail, remains the primary historical source for the archaeology of Central Asia and northern India in the 7th century. When Aurel Stein set out in 1900 to map the buried cities of the Silk Road, he brought Xuanzang's account as his field guide. The ruins were exactly where Xuanzang had described them, in exactly the condition Xuanzang had described them. The ruins had simply been buried a little deeper. And then there is the novel. In the 16th century, a writer named Wu Chenggen took Xuanzang's journey, the desert crossing, the hostile kings who tried to detain him, the mountain passes, the arrival at a great library full of texts that needed to be brought home, and transformed it into a fantasy. He gave the monk a monkey companion with supernatural powers. He gave the monkey a greedy pig and a reformed river dragon. He gave them 72 demons, a jade emperor, and a journey that ends with the heroes ascending into heaven in golden light. Journey to the West is among the most widely read works of fiction in human history. 1 billion people know the story. A fraction of that number know that the monk at its center was real, that the desert crossing was real, that the bones used as waymarkers in the sand were real. The real Xuanzang never met a demon. He met something harder, a world actively in the process of ending. Kingdom after kingdom, monastery after monastery, library after library, each one slightly more ruined than the last. He walked through the wreckage and wrote down what he saw with the systematic precision of a man who understood, more clearly than perhaps anyone else alive in the 7th century, that civilizations are fragile, that texts are mortal, and that the only thing that reliably outlasts stone is a careful record of what the stone once was. The monkey is fiction. The bones in the sand were real. Tell me in the comments, which civilization should we reconstruct next? The Kushan Empire that Xuanzang found in ruins, or the Göktürk Khaganate at the peak of its power? See you on the next journey.